Morning guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. Ferrari have reportedly responded to the big power unit drama which emerged over the last 24 hours, where Mercedes and potentially Red Bull as well have found a way to generate 15 extra brake horsepower than their rivals next season through a trick and a grey area in the rules. Are they really doing that? That's been a key discussion of the day because many engineers simply do not believe the rumour is actually possible, but Ferrari apparently say that if they are, they will do everything to shut it down before the season gets underway in Melbourne. But if that is the case, and Mercedes engines are declared illegal, it's likely they won't be able to make a new one in time for the season opener. Very much into your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. Plenty as ever to discuss. We're going to start here. Sergio Perez, he will officially be using the number 11. We saw this actually confirmed yesterday by the FIA, but Perez himself says it again today. So there is some continuity there with Sergio Perez. Not the case, as we understand, with Max Verstappen, who is going to number 3 for next season. Just wanted to quickly share this as well. Here's Albert Fabrega talking about the Madrid, the Spanish Grand Prix. Just a little update on this because this is pretty much the last Grand Prix of the European stint next season. That is for good reason. They're trying to get it ready in time. Look, I'm not a big fan of the track layout by any means, but it's definitely a big job to get this ready for next year. As we know, these are some of the, I think, footages that we haven't really seen so far on what it actually looks like right now. That construction site got to be ready by the middle of next year. They say it's perfectly fine and they'll be done in time, but there was a rumour recently that they might not be, and therefore they might need to replace it with something like Imola. We know that Portimao is coming on the circuit in 27-28 in replacement for Zandvoort, but the Madrid is meant to be on the grid, on the calendar, for the next decade. So these are the, well, pieces of information that we have so far on the Grand Prix. We'll see what time says on that. The next thing to talk about, bit of drama here, is Max Verstappen. So he won Overtake of the Year 2025. Every month, the fans vote for the best overtake of the month. They put them all together at the end of the year. The winner was Max on Piastri at Imola, which in my opinion is absolutely the right answer. This is what I voted for. Jaw-dropping moment of the season in my opinion. However, he did not win the fan poll, which is interesting. So this was the website, and, well, it describes the following. Thank you for voting. Voting is now closed. Winner announced shortly. And they describe in the replies that the fans select from a short list of the best on-track action every month, and at the end of the season, all the winners go up against one another. The fans vote. So the fans vote to decide the definitive on-track move of the season and crown the champion. So it says this is totally fan voted, but is it actually? Because these were the results of the poll as far as I understand, and when I was looking at this, indeed, Charles Leclerc's overtake at the Netherlands against George Russell was the most voted. So these were the votes in their respective orders. It was Leclerc on Russell. That's very impressive overtake down the inside of into, let's say, the stadium section in Zandvoort towards the end of the lap at the end of the second sector. Look, fantastic overtake, the type of racing I think that we do want to see. But as many of us pointed out at the time, this overtake was probably illegal because he did, as it appears in this image and in others, have all of his four wheels over the white line of the track. So, look, it was very hard racing. It was, you know, in my opinion, probably on the borderline of being fair. But I think arguably this overtake might not have stood if they'd have really looked at it particularly closely. Again, I think it was great racing. I'm glad that Leclerc went for the move. But it's one of those things that it was a little bit of talk about it after the Grand Prix was over. So, as it turned out, he won the poll over Verstappen in Imola. Then, who was the other ones? 8% was Hamilton in Silverstone. That double overtake against Russell and Ocon in the wet was pretty impressive. His overtake on Lawson was not especially memorable, I guess. I think it was around the outside of turn 5, turn 6. Maybe that was a pretty good one as well. Behrman against Verstappen in Mexico was pretty good. Piastri in Abu Dhabi against Norris, you know, didn't really matter at the end of the day, but it was a good move. I think Piastri's move on Hamilton in Australia and even in Saudi, but I think especially Australia was more worthy of discussion here. But yeah, Leclerc, he had more fans voted the poll. Look, to me, Verstappen's overtake was the winner. That's what they've decided to do, but, you know, still a bit of drama, right? Because they say that it's a fan-voted poll. Pretty sure the fans voted for Leclerc, but Verstappen wins the award anyway. So intrigued to your thoughts on that in the comments. let's talk Ferrari, and especially their reaction to what is happening in this power unit gate, as some people are now terming it. They will need to have a better year next year. If their engine is not on the same level as a Mercedes, well, good luck with that, because if it's 15 brake horsepower down, if it's 0.3 a lap, we think that roughly equates to down over a Grand Prix distance, that's near enough 17, 20 seconds depending on the track. That's a pretty big deficit to overcome on purely aerodynamic advantage, and that's probably not going to be happening for Ferrari. So Vasseur talks about the importance of this year, the challenge of Hamilton making the switch to Ferrari, the improvement that all parties need to make for them next year. Vasseur also says, we decided to stop aero development after 5 or 6 races. That was a tough one, but I'm still convinced it was the right one. If I underestimated something at this stage, it was the psychological effect on every single team member, including the drivers. It's pretty interesting for him to say that in hindsight, they stopped development very early. I mean, there was even an upgrade package that they had designed and were ready to bring, but they decided not to build it so they could save money effectively for next year. So, look, they were doomed for having a challenging rest of the season. It was not much of a surprise that they effectively went backwards as the season went on. But also, Vasseur thinks that took a toll on Leclerc, and especially took a toll on Hamilton, because the car was going backwards. The frustration was really hitting, let's say, the peak. But Hamilton himself admitted earlier in the season he was on board with this idea, right? Sacrifice the development, focus on next year. Of course, whether that focus on next year will actually heed any results, time will tell. There's also discussion about this man on the left-hand side, Riccardo Adami. We know that he's been the race engineer of Lewis Hamilton this year. Didn't feel to many of us like that relationship was especially strong. Even on the final Grand Prix, Hamilton was not very happy with Adami on the radio. Then at the end of the Grand Prix, Hamilton says, oh, well, thanks, guys. We gave it our all this year. I'll always try my best for you, etc. Thanks for giving me a good car today to make some progress in the field, all that stuff. And Adami didn't even reply. And Hamilton was like, the one thing you don't reply to me on. And then Adami's like, oh, I was talking with the team, or whatever he said. So it just feels like it's not been an ideal relationship there. Hamilton will be staying in the driver's seat, so do they look for another race engineer? I think, to be honest, they probably should. Vasseur says, we are evaluating all options, which sounds to me that it's more likely that Hamilton has a different race engineer than less likely. But again, who else do you put in? Do they also fit very much so the Ferrari mold? Another good question, right? So intrigued to your thoughts in the comments. But let's talk about this key drama, because yesterday we talked about this German publication, Motorsport magazine. They talked about this rumour that Red Bull powertrains and Mercedes have found a trick with the engines. As concisely as possible, the trick is as follows. The compression in the cylinders in the engine is 16:1, mandated this upcoming year by Formula 1. Recently, over the last few years, it's been 18:1. The teams want to get back to 18:1 if they can, to generate more power from the same amount of fuel. And they're not allowed to do it when the car is cold, when it's actually tested. But rumour has it that when the car is actually running and it's hot, they're able to generate higher compression. Now, if they were able to achieve this, they'd be able to generate a performance advantage over what the other teams have been capable of. Now, there's two sides to this story, because the FIA were actually very clear, and people have asked them about this, and they have said, okay, how are we testing whether that complies? There's a few things they've added. In recent days, they've actually added more wording here to, and actually each PU manufacturer comes up with a procedure to test this, but that procedure has to be aligned with the FIA's own technical documents, and it's all sorts of complications. So they've added all these lines in recent days. I think it's pretty obvious that they recognise this could be a point of contention for the upcoming season. But the FIA, in response to this, have been quite clear. They say pretty precisely that it's tested at ambient temperatures, and if it's 16:1, I mean, effectively, when the piston is furthest out of the cylinder, the volume inside the cylinder then, compared to what it is when the cylinder is at its furthest, most compressed point, what is the comparison in the volume? It can't be more than 16:1 in this rule cycle. But when the car is hot, maybe it's different. Now, That's what Mercedes, if they are doing this, would say, because it cannot be higher than 16.0 to 1. So that's the argument. But equally, there's another point in the regulations that says the cars must always comply with the regulations in their entirety during a competition. So you've got two sides, right? The regulations simultaneously say, well, it must comply at all times, but they also say that it's tested at ambient temperature, and the FIA even doubled down on that point. There was actually lots of talk yesterday from Ferrari fans, and understandably, that were saying, damn, that the FIA, they're siding with Mercedes, right? They're letting Mercedes get away with it, as it were. Now, maybe not, or maybe they're not doing it in the way that we thought they were. Maybe there's a different trick. But it's very clear that this is a key conversation. The FIA have even confirmed that discussions are ongoing between the teams. Reportedly, if there is set to be a protest, we might hear about that relatively soon. Now, Auto Racer, they did a good job putting together some of the pieces of this puzzle, and I'll link the entire article down below as always. But these are some of the key highlights from their discussions they have had and what some engineers actually say on this matter. Because as we discussed yesterday, the rumour as to how Mercedes might be doing this, mainly Mercedes, presumably, but potentially Red Bull powertrains as well, is through some sort of thermal expansion, thermal deformation, where different components in the engine would expand in different ways at different temperature ranges. They'd be able to push that compression up in, maybe you could do it in various ways. Theoretically, it is possible, maybe. But apparently, practically, this would be an enormous challenge. To go from 16 to 1 to 18 to 1 purely through thermal deformation is considered by engineers that have thought about this to be highly unlikely. You'd need very different expansion rates. You'd need, to compensate for the extreme thermal stress. You'd need to ensure that it was properly lubricated, severe risks of reliability problems. That is a fair assessment, right? You'd be taking a lot of risk, understandably, to go from, to have this idea of the compression. In fact, when Honda tried to make this jump to 18 to 1 as it previously was, that took them a number of engine redesigns to make it happen. So it's not something that can be done easily, right? This required architectural changes. And in fact, in 2026, it's considered this is even harder to do due to banning of various technologies and difficulty in managing the instant of the flow. Of course, the engines are kind of the same, but they'll always make some changes. And there's new fuels, right? Which creates issue in terms of engine knocking and controlling the ignition, because that's the issue. If you expand it to 18 to 1, you get the risk of premature ignition, and that causes all sorts of other issues. So if Mercedes or Red Bull are achieving this through thermal deformation alone, that would be not only incredibly impressive, but equally, apparently, very unlikely indeed. So there could be something else going on. There's a feeling that this wide range of compression is quite unrealistic, and the engine expands when it heats up. Maybe even on the Ferrari or on the Honda, it's going from 16 to 1 to 16.2 to 1 or something like that when it's operating, but you're not able to test that while it's operating, so you don't really know. Any feasible solution would likely involve a much smaller effective change with notable drawbacks as well. So this then comes on to the question of, are Mercedes really doing this? Is there something else going on? Because the manufacturers seem to think that Mercedes have the best engine for next year. So there is maybe an incentive for the other teams to pile some pressure on Mercedes and put them really under scrutiny of the FIA to see if they can find a way to work around this in a way. Some observers believe the issue has been overstated, particularly regarding the magnitude of that increase in compression compared to the actual performance benefit that they might have. The complication is in addition to the fact that these power units have been homologated. The crankshafts cannot be modified. The pistons can only be updated in a couple of years' time. It's all under the cost cap. So if the FIA come along and they say, hey, Mercedes, actually, no, we found your engine doesn't work anymore, then that doesn't really work, right? Mercedes are probably in that scenario turning up to the first Grand Prix with no engine in their cars and no engine in the McLarens or the Williams or the Alpines. So that probably won't happen. That is why there are loads of questions on exactly where we are here. Because Donadoni here suggests that it could just be quite a lot of noise. There's probably something going on, but Is it as serious as people are making it out to be? Dr. Robs, who knows a fair few people at Red Bull, he actually went on to say that most that he has spoken to believe that it's basically not possible to get this increase by purely thermal expansion. So either Mercedes have some other trick up their sleeve, which of course would be possible, but difficult to imagine what it would be. But he does say that people he know are brainstorming this, and they think that there could be some level of believability. It's not totally outrageous. It would require a lot of thinking, I think, for some of the top engineers to come up with a solution that might actually achieve these results. Definitely interested to hear your thoughts in the comments below. The other key development here is how we actually found out about this. So there was a Motorsport Italia article that came out and said that somebody changed teams, basically, and went from either Mercedes or from Red Bull to a different team, and effectively then said, hey, that's what we are up to, that team. And, who knows, right? This is a relatively frequent phenomenon, but it is interesting timing because, as I say, the engines have been homologated, the power units have been given the approval of the FIA, so kind of difficult now in hindsight. Look, I'm sure that there are certain people out there, if you're a big Ferrari fan, if you're a big Aston Martin fan, that wouldn't be opposed to Mercedes not being able to have a car at the start of next season, nor McLaren or whatever. But the reality is that's probably not going to be happening when we turn up to Melbourne. So creates a load of drama, and it's interesting the timing, because if someone was to have recently left one of those teams, now that we have all the power units homologated and now they're starting to talk a little bit, then the ball is in the court of the FIA is the bottom line. Now, apparently, Ferrari, an engineer at Ferrari, talked to CL16__fanpage FR, who has said some things before. So I don't disagree with the sources here. I just, take it with a pinch of salt, of course. But it is interesting because he references, apparently, article C1.5, which is the article we discussed earlier, that describes that every single component must be within the rules at all times in a competition. And therefore, Ferrari's opinion is, look, this requirement must be respected at all times. This is not a war that Ferrari are willing to lose. The FIA will have no choice but to find what they describe as a castration solution for those that are non-compliant. Again, is there a way, whatever Mercedes are doing, even if they are doing anything, let's say that they are, let's say they've found a way to increase the compression. Is it possible to find something that they can change in the engine that prevents that from actually happening so that they can still go racing? Because that's the issue here, right? Like, if the changes that Mercedes would have to make to be compliant, if they're not being compliant, which is difficult enough to test anyway, then look, if their car is illegal by the rules, then yeah, they won't be able to race. But, realistically, what are the chances of that? I'd say pretty damn slim. So, yeah, look, Ferrari, they also know what it's like to be playing with trickery in the engines, right? So, apparently that's Ferrari's perspective, though. Ferrari are suggesting that if the cars aren't legal at all times, we will be protesting. So, definitely implies that they think that something might be going on at Mercedes. This was, actually, that picture from that overtake earlier in the year. But, reportedly, in the event of a complaint, the FIA will need to decide. The FIA and the engine manufacturers meet this Monday, so we're just a few days away from the teams getting together with the FIA and saying, I guess what's Saturday today, so yeah, Monday the 22nd, just before Christmas, they're having a meeting to say, okay, this is what the situation is. If you're not compliant, the FIA are going to have to do something about it. So yeah, as ever, massively intrigued to your thoughts on all of this stuff in the comments below. Just one final thing thought was kind of interesting. George Russell completed 99.86% of Grand Prix laps this season. He only missed out on 2. Those 2, if you don't remember, were because he was lapped in Monaco. So remarkable reliability, consistency from George and Mercedes this season. Everyone else was either taken out at some point or crashed of their own accord or had an engine fault or whatever the case was, or of course was lapped multiple times. But in George's case, he was lapped twice in Monaco on a truly horrific weekend for Mercedes. Then he got a penalty as well that he had to serve, and therefore he was lapped again. So still pretty impressive. Effectively, he completed every lap, more so than every other driver. But yeah, he wasn't able to complete the final couple in Monaco. I guess he did 76 of the 78 that weekend. So very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.